The very first case that actually got the entire cold case team started was the two sexual assault investigations that began in 1998 when we were looking for an unknown serial rapist who was named Claudine Hall. This was the particular case that started the whole ball rolling. Right after that, less than 2 weeks later, we get one on May 21st of 1998 that starts similar to what was happened 13 days earlier. And I didn't know that it was going to be related to these two, but once you put all three cases together, the lab work came back and showed that all three were linked, which then automatically runs it back to July of 1991 because they were linked by the evidence too.
And I remember you coming to me and saying, there's a lot more Claudine Halls out there. In fact, he even said in his interview, there's more of me out there.
That's exactly
And so I think it's important to identify the resources to start working these types of offenders, hence the birth of the cold case team for sexual assaults. Nobody had really ever looked at sex assault cold cases. There was a lot of information out there about homicide cold cases. So we got together, our unit and the victim services unit for the Phoenix Police Department, and we started discussing, well, who do we want on this team? Went to the most experienced detective on the unit at the time, which was Don Newcomer.
Initially, when I started working with the cold case team, I was the cold case team, so to speak. And then we realized that it just couldn't be done by one person.
The first few months of the grant, what we were doing is really identifying cases that we would want to work, developing a database that we could archive this information into, and then seeing if we actually had the evidence available in our property room in order for us to identify any suspects.
We also had a crime analyst individual that was on our team. He was responsible for setting up a database that would also help us to link some of these cases in addition to forensically linking these cases.
And we started with a very simplistic database, and then I was able to bring together other access databases that the Phoenix Police Department was using in their sex crimes area and incorporate all that data into one database so that everyone could use it. We went from about 5 or 6 databases down to one. There's one place that they can go and get something rather than having to read through thousands of cases. It's, you know, a push of a button.
Jeff was able to devise this database that helps not only the detectives track their cases, but also helps us. I can call over to the Sex Assault Bureau and ask them for numbers. How many cases have you processed this month? How many have you researched? With the inception of the STOP grant, we were able to employ a forensic scientist, and that forensic scientist, Jennifer Palmer, actually came up with the idea of the forensic nurse staining the slides. And with grant money, we were able to provide the resources to the nurse.
The fast tracking that we do for the City of Phoenix is unique to the City of Phoenix. They are the only agency that works with us and has us do this for them. It makes us feel very involved, and it assists in helping to speed up the process. So we identify, if a slide is identified as having sperm or DNA on it, when it goes to the crime lab, it skips the screening process and goes directly to analysis.
In reality, prior to receiving the federal funds, we were waiting anywhere from 9 months to almost a year and a half or a year to get some of our analysis done, for the simple fact that you're putting 40 pounds of potatoes through a 10-pound bag when it comes to the laboratory.
Probably if I were to have my perfect little world, it would be a faster science, and the identification would be a quicker process that could occur in order to help these patients not have to wait and come back and hear years down the line, oh, by the way, something did happen and now we need to talk about it again.
In these particular cases, your victim has made it through the process once to report, and now several years later, you're bringing up this investigation again because you want to identify this suspect. So there's a lot of victim issues, so you definitely want to make sure that you have resources and advocacy available for that victim as these issues start to come forward.
They may have started a new life. They may be embarrassed. They may be re-traumatized when they find out that that a hit has been made or someone has been caught. So they need somebody, an impartial person, not a detective, not with the police department, to just talk to. The greatest lessons I've learned as being part of the cold case team is that no matter how much time passes, a crime victim does not truly get over what has happened, especially without the benefit of counseling.
It's not just a piece of paper, it's not just a case. These are people. These are lives that have been affected forever, really.
Forever.
You know, you can murder somebody once, but in a lot of these cases, they are murdered every day by what they've been through. Some of them have recovered, moved on, others probably have never recovered. We decided to house our cold case sex assault team here at the City of Phoenix Family Advocacy Center because it started out really looking at sexual assault. And this was a facility that was non-police. It provided an area where we can do sexual assault examinations. It provided an area for detectives to be housed and do their investigation. It also provided an area for victim advocacy, resources.
This is a comfortable place for victims to come to be interviewed because it is not a traditional law enforcement building. It has more of a familial style. We have a play area and places for them to sit and wait and have snacks and that type of thing. It's just more comfortable.
One of the lessons we learned was anticipating the results of your work. There's really two phases in cold case. The first phase is identifying cases, reviewing these cases, and submitting the evidence. And you're sitting there with your one detective and your crime analyst, and you think, hey, this is all going really well. And then the hits start coming back as the databases start building.
And then you'll just be deluged afterwards with DNA hits.
We really got hammered at the end when we started getting triple-digit CODIS hits.
The issue of CODIS hits, pardon me for using an acronym, but the DNA hits that identified suspects through prison DNA checks, arrest DNA checks, anything that we had that populated that database system was there. And I asked, well, how many suspects do we have active hits on? And I was told at the time I got here we had 150 CODIS hits, DNA identified suspects, that I had 2 detectives assigned to this unit. Well, just from a management standpoint, you look at that and you say, my goodness, how could they even make an impact? And the shocking part about it was, what if one of those people reoffend? And so this is stuff nightmares is made of. To think that you have a person identified in a sexual assault case and you don't have the organizational resources to attack that, that just made me crazy. And I'll tell you, I had some sleepless nights. Short term, just dump resources into it. Long term, make sure that you've got the sustainability in this program to keep this going.
The other thing that I wanted to point out is cold cases are complex. That's the reason they're cold. Nobody has the time to sit there and deal with the case because there's so much work that's involved with it.
If they were easy, they wouldn't be cold and we'd have them solved.
That's correct.
What keeps us going is every piece of evidence in this 55,000 square foot warehouse, in the freezer, in the refrigerator, has someone attached to it, whether it be a lost piece of property or the victim of a crime. DNA evidence typically is connected to some very emotional cases, whether it be a homicide or a sexual assault. It's very important for us to maintain that evidence and to work closely with the cold case detectives so that we can find that offender, put that offender away, take them off the street so they can't offend anymore.
We've teamed with the prosecutor's office, with Rachel Mitchell, David Lish, and Rachel Fipsionis. They all have been identified as investigators, prosecutors that are specifically assigned to work these cold cases. So they understand the issues when they get to trial of chain of custody, of testimony and witnesses' statements and victim statements, and the importance and the understanding how to use DNA in a courtroom.
If you walk into the courtroom thinking, well, all I have to prove is that there's DNA and this is the person whose DNA it is, you may not be very successful as a prosecutor. What you really need is to understand that sometimes people get into these situations and unfortunately are sexually assaulted, and you have to explain to the jury that just because somebody has done something that they wouldn't consider doing. For example, you may have someone on the jury that thinks, well, I would never go to a bar and talk to a strange man. And you have to understand ways to explain to the jury that just because somebody did that does not mean that they asked to be sexually assaulted. The big thing that you have to explain to the jury is that sexual predators prey on vulnerable people. And sometimes that vulnerability can be in a physical problem, and sometimes that vulnerability can be because they are impaired by alcohol or the use of drugs, and sometimes that vulnerability can be basically their lot in life and their place in society. So if that person is working as a prostitute, that's not something that you look down on and say, well, she deserved it. That's something that they need to understand. That's a vulnerability, and that vulnerability was exploited by a sexual predator.
When you're getting into sex crimes, then you're looking at basically individuals that do this sort of thing because that's what they do. They have a propensity to commit sexual aberrant acts, so therefore they're not going to stop at just one.